This is a Geek Leader podcast, and I'm your host, John Rauda. This show is all about helping us grow as leaders, become better technologists, and improve our lives both at work and at home. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a lot. Welcome to a Geek Leader podcast. I'm your host, John Rauda. And if you could, please do me a favor and take a moment and leave a rating and review in whatever podcast player you're listening to this on, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, doesn't matter. I would greatly appreciate it. And that feedback really helps get other listeners to the show. Also, if you're not subscribed, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you feel so inclined, you can go to geekleader.com/tip and donate to the show. Thanks so much. All right, Geek Leaders, today I'm honored to have Martin Gonzalez on the show. He's the co-author of a book called The Bonfire Moment and a creator at Google's Effective Founder Project. We're going to talk a lot about his time at Google, a lot about this book and the people side of building a team and working with that team. And it's going to be a lot of fun. Anyway, with all that being said, Martin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, John.
If you don't mind, tell the audience a little bit about your background and kind of how you got to where you are today and why you decided to write this book.
Yeah, I think of my career as a bit of a portfolio career, and there are really three parts to that. The first one is my core work at Google. So I've been at Google for about 10 years. I started in our Singapore office, and in this time, I've been very fortunate to work on some of the toughest people challenges that our internal leaders face. So I've spent some time basically across the board, with our devices team, with our Google Search, Maps, YouTube teams. But recently, I've been spending a lot of time with our AI research and engineering groups. And during this time, having moved around with Google quite a bit, helped really build what we call our org development practice, which included things like, helping our mergers and acquisitions come into Google. What brought me here to the US actually a few years ago was the Fitbit acquisition. And so I came in and supported, James and Eric to settle into Google when they came through. So that's the first part of my, first platform in my portfolio career. The second one is I really enjoy teaching, and I do quite a bit of teaching, primarily with Stanford engineering and MBA students, but also spend quite a bit of time in the classrooms at Wharton and in INSEAD, which is a France-based business school. The third one I would say, which has led to this book, is work I've done with startup founders. And really, the origin story of this is when I first joined Google about 10 years ago, I wanted to try out a 20% project. As you probably know, Google allows, Googlers to spend, really it's not 20%. For me, it was more like a 10% project, working on a passion area that's, somehow connected to the company. And I got in touch with Josh, my co-author, who was then heading up the Google for Startup Accelerator. And I raised my hand and said, hey, I'd love to help out. A lot of my friends who were previously in a consulting firm I was part of was then starting all these companies. They were calling me for advice. I thought, I might as well like support Google for Startups if I could. And there was an accelerator program which had all these great programs around, machine learning back then, sales and marketing, and all the ways that you can grow your startup. There was nothing about people and culture. So I told Josh, okay, let me look at the data and see if there's a need here. And I found this classic study from Harvard researchers that basically showed that 65% of startups failed because of people issues. Wow. And that study was again repeated later on. This was already kind of after we had built stuff. But it was the same thing. By far, it was the number one reason my startups failed. And so I told Josh, give me some budget. Let's pilot something small. So we ran a very simple pilot in Jakarta among founders there. And this part of the accelerator program ranked like easily the highest among all the other kinds of workshops and offerings we had done. And we thought, look, like this could just be an anomaly. Let's try it one more time. We tried it in Bangalore. Again, the top-rated part of the accelerator experience. And then we brought it to Sao Paulo. And at some point, this program has now reached founders in about 70 countries. And so we knew that we were sitting on a lot of data and a lot of experience in supporting these tech entrepreneurs. And so this is where the book comes about, where we capture in the book two things. One is we summarize all that we've learned in supporting all these founders, and then we open source the workshop and we give out all the tools that we've brought to these entrepreneurs around the world. And we found, John, that while this has been built and rooted in the startup ecosystem, so much of this has been really relevant in even bigger tech companies and nonprofits as well. So we're hoping that folks draw a lot of good from the book.
Yeah, no, I think this is going to be super interesting. But before we get into the book, I want to talk a little bit about your time teaching, because you mentioned that's a passion of yours, and that's a passion of mine. So, I teach part-time at Wharton University, computer science department there. So I think it's a super interesting thing. What do you get most out of that?
Yeah, so I come from a line of teachers. Both my grandparents were teachers. I have uncles who also teach in university. A lot of my formative years were in my undergrad and then later on in my grad school programs. And, in many ways, I found myself through the help of, professors who were, who took me on as a mentee. Initially, I thought I would really enjoy standing in front of the room and teaching, bright students. And I realized actually that what I enjoyed the most Friday late afternoons to evenings, I spent time on campus just doing office hours. And I find that that's actually the most interesting part of the teaching, because then you learn about their stories and their aspirations. And I don't know, it feeds my soul somehow. I don't know, what's been your experience? Why do you, because this is ultimately charity work. I mean, no one gets paid big money for
100%.
Teaching, right?
Yeah, 100%. I justify the time you put into teaching versus the money you get back out of it. Yeah, but with other means, but you're right. I think it's whenever you get an email from a student or a LinkedIn message from a student from like 3 or 4 years ago that's, working somewhere great and has a great experience, and they just want to say, I got a lot out of your class. Your class helped me get here, or something like that. It means the world to you, But also, for me, it's a way that I can keep myself current. Like when you get into a leadership role as a manager, director, VP somewhere, you have to take a step back from technology, and you're looking more at strategy or higher level, and being able to go in and teach computer science, teaching freshmen and sophomores and juniors, you have to dig back into that, because if you say something wrong, if you're wrong, they're gonna hold you accountable to that.
Yeah. That's right.
There. It's also a great way to find good talent, But you're right, building that next generation, and I've always said that one of the reasons why I do this podcast, one of the reasons why I teach is, my kids, I have 3 kids, and one day they're going to get a job, hopefully in tech, fingers crossed. But either way, they're going to get a job somewhere. And I want to make sure that their bosses and their leaders out there are good leaders and good mentors and good people for them. And if I can lay the groundwork for that in any ways, as small as possible, that I'm doing, I want to keep doing that.
That's great, John. You and I share the same energy and passion for it. We also share the fact that we have 3 kids. So yes, we need to build the next generation of leaders for sure.
And I'm sure that keeps you as busy as it does me.
Yes, indeed.
So I've gone through the entrepreneur startup world before, where I've had a startup that I built with 2 other fraternity brothers of mine out of college. And, we ran that for 7 years before selling it out and, moving into corporate America. I think a big part of what helped make that successful was the relationships and the fact that these were, my fraternity brothers. These are people that I trusted, that I could share anything, with and build that thing. And you guys come up with this idea of a bonfire moment. What is a bonfire moment exactly? How would you define someone who's completely clueless to this?
So I'll answer that in a quick sec. But, the one thing to say is consider yourself lucky for having succeeded with fraternity brothers, because what the data shows, and look, like, I'm very clear. I myself have not been an entrepreneur, but that then forces me to lean on the data, right? And this is what the data shows. The most unstable partnerships are partnerships that were originated from either friends and family.
Wow.
And part of the reason for that is the relationship of a friend or a family coupled with, partnering on a business. Like, it's doubly expensive as a relationship. And so people become a little bit more careful not to hurt the relationship, and therefore the chances of you having some of the tough conversations about people contributing or being as committed as you are, and all these important conversations that need to happen, tend to be harder to come by when that's the origin story of a relationship. So it's good to hear that you seem to have had a good exit, but that's not the usual story. So the bonfire moment actually, so first of all, we know that 65% of startups fail because of people issues. And so the bonfire moment really helps startup teams dig into those people issues. We know that the number one source of these challenges are co-founder conflict. It's also, not being able to work well together, all the many irritations and annoyances that you later on discover that you don't see in the early days. All of that gets in the way. And so the bonfire moment is one intense day. People can do it in 2 separate days or 3 separate days, but we encourage people to set aside one day, and they go through through a fairly structured process that, by the way, isn't comfortable or cozy. It's not a campfire moment. It's a bonfire moment. There's an intensity to the experience. And they come out of it feeling a lot more connected to the mission, connected to each other, and with a deeper sense of understanding on how they can be a more effective team. Maybe to give you just an insight into what that day looks like, the day starts with inviting people to introspect and assess themselves actually against a data set of founders from around the world to see how effectively do they deploy some of the important strategies that that we know from our data set effective founders employ. And then we invite them to write up what we call the user guide, which is really almost an instruction manual of how to work best with me. Here are the motivations I bring to this work. Here's how you can give me feedback. Here's how I like to resolve conflict. If the team breaks up because of the relationships in the team, here are the likely reasons for it, and how do we then mitigate some of that? And then we get to the heart of the event of the day, which we affectionately call the bullshit circle. And the bullshit circle is premised on the idea that part of the journey of an entrepreneur or of any team that's really working on really bold, ambitious goals is setbacks and self-doubt and insecurity. And in the bullshit circle, we invite people to reflect on the biggest insecurities they bring to the work, and then talk about what are some of the masks that we wear to kind of cover up and protect ourselves through that, and how it maybe contributes to some toxicity in the team. And then finally, we cap the 8 hours with a chance for them to look through a list of 20 of the most common sources of conflict we've seen in supporting founders across the world, and we invite them to then work through the ones that they feel are either apparent at the moment or they have not yet quite planned around, to then either avoid or solve some of these unspoken issues. So it's a chance to deal with the elephants in the room, with all that built up, I guess, mutual understanding from the early parts of the day. So that's the bonfire moment, and we've seen it just open people's eyes and strengthen teams across the world.
I think that's great. And I think, when you look at putting on different masks because of insecurities, I think that's one of the big things that, even if you're not at a startup, if you're just working in a department somewhere, and you're leading a tech group, you have those same kind of problems, those same kind of issues that come up, because we all have some insecurities and some fear. And figuring out what that is, and honestly, you can step back out of work and say, just in relationships in general and life in general, we all have insecurities and fears and things that, there's things that I probably should bring up to my mom, but I don't want to because I'm afraid to, right? You have those insecurities and those fears. How do you guys go about, once you've identified them and figure out the mask that you're wearing, how do you pull those masks off?
Yeah, well, the first thing that the bullshit circle really does is it helps normalize the fact that everyone carries these. One of my favorite moments, early core memories of scaling this program was actually in the very first in Jakarta. One of the first people that shared said something like, every time I approach an investor and they ask if I had gone to Harvard or Stanford or worked at Microsoft or Google or Amazon, and I say no to both, I can see their face ever so slightly drop, kind of knowing that, okay, I'm not talking to a high caliber person, and that's kind of that person's insecurity. And then right after that person comes another founder and said, look, I graduated from Stanford and I spent some time at Google, and I anyway feel just as insecure as I go about these investor meetings. And just something about normalizing the fact that everyone carries some of this is already the very first thing. The second thing I'd say is we in the bullshit circle, we invite people to reflect on, we've seen that, and the research will show that there tends to be three kinds of masks we tend to wear. There's the mask of false optimism, false strength, and false detachment. And real quick, false optimism is the mask where under pressure, under self-doubt, you become extra helpful, you become extra positive, and maybe to a toxic degree, perhaps, you try to pump people up, you kind of create this image that everything is okay. Mm-hmm. False strength is where you lean on prestige and past achievements as a way to kind of power through these moments of insecurity. This, by the way, is my number one way of coping in these moments. And then the third one is false detachment, which is trying to show calm, independence, being incognito, out of the limelight, again, as a way to cope. And, we'll probably deploy one or two or all of these three, but helping founders just realize, helping leaders realize, okay, it's actually, I tend to maybe speak too much about my past achievements when I'm under insecure. Like even that alone becomes a good way to acknowledge. And then the push to these leaders is, hey, talk to your teams about this. Like tell them, because by the way, the upside is they understand you. The downside is actually a lot of leaders, what they ask me is, should I tell my team about this? Because, what if they lose confidence in me as a leader? And my number one response is, well, why do you think they don't know already? Really, the only thing you gain is that you acknowledge it and they realize that you are aware of it, and that's only upside. There's very little downside.
No, I think that's great. I think acknowledging, because a lot of times they do know, right? And they've already figured it out on their own. And to share with them, to show them that you're self-aware enough and vulnerable enough to present the truth and transparency out there is really important. And I know, like for me, I kind of lean on my past successes more than I probably should whenever I'm insecure, because I'll be like, oh, we did this, 10 years ago, this with different technology, with different market, different everything, so it's not quite the same. But I'll lean on that confidence, even though I'm, completely terrified of what we're about to do.
Yeah.
So when it comes to, conflict within that team, we all know conflict is important, and you have to have conflict. And one of the books that I lean on that's really important to me when it comes to leadership is a book called Herding Tigers by Todd Henry, where he talks about like leading, really high performing teams. And, he talks about there, if you have a team that doesn't have conflict, you've got a terrible team. You've got to have a team with healthy conflict. How do you encourage healthy conflict and make sure that it stays healthy?
So one of my favorite stories in the history of computer science is there's this lab manager named Bob Taylor in Xerox PARC. So for your listeners, Xerox PARC in the late 70s, early 80s was probably the most prolific place for innovation. It kind of succeeded Bell Labs as that kind of place where a lot of innovation thrived. But Xerox PARC, kind of long story short, is where you get personal computing. It's where you get the technologies that ultimately fed Apple and Pixar and 3Com and Adobe. So a lot of great things. So Bob Taylor, who himself was not a researcher, by the way, like he had a PhD in another field, but he was not a computer scientist. He said that his job as a leader of that lab was to make sure that he graduated class 1 disagreements into class 2 disagreements. So let me tell you what he meant by that. So class 1 disagreements were disagreements that were either personality-based or that were straw man arguments. So I take your argument, John, I represent it in the weakest way possible, making it easy for me to then refute, and that's how I then win the argument. That's a class 1 disagreement. A class 2 disagreement, as he calls it, is when I strongman your argument, which is I hear your argument, John, here are the best parts of it, and let me read it back to you in a way that you feel really satisfied with how I'm representing your idea, and then I can go about, presenting mine. Now, what Bob says is that it's not his job to resolve disagreements. It is simply his job to make sure that all Class 1 disagreements graduate to Class 2 disagreements. And I think that frames up really well what leaders should be doing.
Mm. No, I think that's really good. I like that idea, because you do see some people that are they're better at articulating things, right? So if there's a disagreement, they're going to win. Whether they're right or wrong, they're just better at that. So being able to come in there and kind of mediate and show like there's merit to both sides, and I'll figure it out. Courage.
And almost to ask, like, John, what do you think, Martin? Like, what do you think the best parts of Martin's argument is? And just asking a simple question like that already gets you further along.
Yeah, absolutely, it does. And I think that also shows that if you can ask that question and answer it effectively, then you listened. And I think listening is one of the things that we don't do very well as a team and as technologists. When we're having those disagreements, we're while the other person is talking, we're already thinking of our next response.
Yeah. One thing that we read about in the book, we actually have a whole chapter on disagreements. We call it the trap of the inner circle. And we talk about how, when there are power dynamics in a team, whether it's a manager or it's the leader in the team or someone who's a little bit more outspoken, like as you mentioned, John, whether it's positional or personal power that they wield, there is a tendency for most teams to end up anchoring on a dominant point of view. And one of the hacks that we shared, if you want to increase the quantity of disagreements and conflict in the team, like positive conflict in the team, is we have this very simple thing we call a 2-minute hack, which is at the beginning of the meeting, when you know that there's a decision to come to, don't ask people to share their thoughts right away. In fact, as a leader, you should share your thoughts last. But instead of jumping in to that, ask people to take a Post-it or take a notebook or take their phone and just write their point of view on this topic. And then by doing that, you capture everyone's original ideas. And then you have people read out their ideas and give them uninterrupted time without arguing the pros and cons of the idea. Just give them uninterrupted time, 2 minutes, where they each share their point of view. And that way you get the widest variety of ideas and that are unanchored by the first idea that's shared. And I think if leaders did that more often, I think you'd get a lot more out of your team.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's one of the things that I love the idea of writing it down first, because a lot of times you'll see like the more dominant person will present their idea first and everybody will change their mind. And it's like, you lost out on so many innovations and potential paths because of fear, like, especially when you have different people with somebody's got 10 years of experience and somebody with 2, the person with 2 years of experience, like, maybe,
Yeah. And what happens when you do that is you amplify the errors of the outspoken one. What you want actually in a team, an effective team, you want them to be wrong in different ways. That way you kind of neutralize, the errors of the team. But if everyone is just gravitating towards a single error, then I think that's more difficult to manage.
Yeah, it sounds that way. It sounds like that's a big problem. And this whole idea is basically around building a culture, right? And whenever you already have a culture, let's say that's not good, maybe it's a toxic culture, how does a bonfire moment change that?
So, the bonfire moment really brings to, part of why we've called it the bonfire moment is there's an acknowledgement that teams that are working on really big goals under tight constraints, like it feels like you're constantly in the fire.
Yeah.
And a lot of the toxicity comes from really people just running at lightning speed and just going really, really fast and not really being thoughtful as to how they're collaborating. And so the bonfire moment is a chance for them to step out of that fire for a day and be very introspective and examine the fire together. It's also a chance to kind of make amends and begin to understand people's ways of working. I think slowing the team down, even just for a day before they jump back in, and then helping them in a structured way, like look at what's going on that's going well and not well. I think that alone, it sounds super simple. It's hard work. And then just protecting the time to do that work, I think is one of the most essential parts of the bonfire mode. Our hope is through the book, we structure it in a way that it creates a safe place to then investigate and confront some of these big challenges.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think it's, when you mention creating a safe space, and I know sometimes that term is overused in our society, but I think that's an important thing to understand. And that's one of the things I try to do with my team is we always talk about inside of technology, we can say whatever we want to each other. It's an open game. We talk to each other. We can poke jabs at each other, point fingers, place blame. But outside of that group, we are a team, united front, and we're gonna stand together. We have each other's back. We're moving forward, and that's one. We have this list. I call it the IT code. It's just cultural norms and things that we follow, and and there are just ideas of the fact that everybody has a voice, everybody can speak. We're intentional about our work, and just little things that we're gonna help us follow. And every time we meet to talk about them and we share those cultural norms, we open the floor for anybody to add anything new, or take anything away that's changed, and give everybody an equal footing.
That's so good, John. And I mean, you and I the same. Like, we wish that more teams would be as thoughtful about their culture as that. What's interesting about this, there was some recent research by a French economist who tried to understand what was the true economic upside of a good culture, and the answer is fairly nuanced. Basically, they looked at the stock market returns over, I think, 3 or 4 decades, and they looked at the list of best companies to work for, and they controlled for variances in industry and competitiveness and market dynamics, etc. What they basically concluded was that the upside of a good culture tends to be very subtle during the good years, but when you isolate the crisis years, that's where you see a pretty significant upside. And it says a lot about this problem of culture, right? Which is usually when things are going south and you realize you have a bad culture, you're almost too late at that point. Mm-hmm. And so you want to be doing it when times are good to then cushion you when times are then bad.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I think sometimes when it's, when you're already down, it's, it's so hard to come back from it, when the economy's down and your business is down and revenues are down and things are already so stressful, it's hard to make that pivot into a better culture when you're already so toxic.
Yeah, there's a big meme in the tech industry. You might have heard this, where they say revenue solves all problems. The opposite is also true, that revenue hides all problems. And I think that's really the challenge. When things are good, you feel like everything is good, but really things could be happening underneath the surface. And we encourage teams to be as preemptive on these issues than, as much as they can.
Yeah. One of the things in the book that you talk about is, the imposter syndrome. And I know I've had people on the show before where we mentioned it and talked about it and the self-doubt that comes with that. And I know I've suffered from it before. Can you explain to people that may have maybe their first time tuning in and listening and have no idea, what is the imposter syndrome and how do you help overcome that?
So the imposter syndrome is simply people feeling like, they're not meant to be there. They got through an interview process or a screening process that somehow there was an anomaly in the process, and so I got through, and it's just a matter of time where people will discover that I am actually not who they think I am. What we lay out, we spend a whole chapter in the book on the trap of confidence. We talk about how actually overconfidence and underconfidence, they all have a place in the journey. Overconfidence is almost required at the start of any big project. There's a really interesting Harvard economist who studied large CapEx projects. So he studied building bridges or building airports. And why is it that all these projects tend to be always over budget and tend to launch always late? And he talks about the principle of the hiding hand. And he says how it's almost as necessary for the originators or the founders or the pioneers to not fully understand the true cost of the project. Otherwise, they would never begin. Mm-hmm. And so you almost need to have some amount of delusion at the start of the journey. Now, that becomes almost nearly a complete liability beyond that point, where the problem with being overconfident as you then go through the journey is you will tend to ask for help less. You will tend to underprepare for things, you will tend to overestimate certain investment moves or certain decisions that you make. And then actually, more importantly, when we look at our data of the most and the least effective founders in our data set, we actually found a pretty interesting thing, which is the founders who were at the earliest stages of their skill tended to be a lot more confident. And then as you become more effective, the confidence seemed to be dipping. And then when we saw that in our data, we then tried to see if, I'm sure that was studied elsewhere. And then we discovered the Dunning-Kruger effect, which almost reveals exactly the same thing, which is at early stages of skill, people are more confident, and then they dip in their confidence. And then they eventually increase their confidence as they get better, but it's never at the same height as when you started the journey.
Is that because they don't know what they don't know?
So at the beginning of the journey, you don't know what great looks like. And as soon as you begin to realize what great looks like, then you realize, wow, I am so far away from that. And people that interpret that as, oh, this is a signal of future failure. But really what it is, it's a signal of growth. And so we encourage founders and leaders to really just keep on going, because that's what growth feels like.
Yeah, I think sometimes, when you start something, I can go way back to when I started, my little startup that we ran for a little bit. And it was one of those things where, at the beginning, I didn't know what it meant to be successful, but I also didn't know how hard it was going to be. I had delusions of I remember watching, this is back in the late 90s, and all these companies were having startups. They were just making so much money. And it's like, okay, well, I can do this, no problem. And I do this startup, and all of a sudden, it's so much work that I didn't expect. And then it was I don't know if I could do this. This is more than I wanted it to be. But so again, your confidence kind of drops back a little bit at that point, and you're starting to see other companies God, I wish I could be. Why didn't I get that client? Why didn't I get that business? I could have done that. And you kind of have that self doubt, and then you start building up and realizing that, well, if they can do it, I can do it too. I met this guy. Yeah. This guy, is running this business. And you start building back up. I think after that, at least that's my experience.
Yeah, and what's happening there when you're meeting other people and realizing you could do the same. What's happening there, and this is where the data shows is probably the most effective way to overcome to some extent your imposter syndrome, is to normalize it. Is to just realize that everyone faces it, everyone feels this way, and that already helps. At least that's what the evidence shows.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when I think about the imposter syndrome and having that fear, one of the things that helps me is understanding that almost everybody has this. Almost everybody, at one point in their life is going to suffer this. Everybody that I've ever talked to and mentioned it, maybe they didn't know what it was, but they've had that same feeling whenever you start to have success, that, man, I don't feel like I should be here. I don't feel like I'm qualified. And there was a book that I read, actually, this is probably 10 years ago now, called Unqualified. It was all about that feeling of, I'm here, but I don't feel like I should be here. I don't feel qualified. It was all about the imposter syndrome, but I don't think they ever called it the imposter syndrome in that book. But, it's that same thought that, I'll never forget when I first became a manager. I was like, God, why did they pick me?
Yeah. And, some of that, and I think the way the research has talked about imposter syndrome has always been, it's something to fix. Mm-hmm. There's an interesting researcher out of Wharton who kind of turns it on its head and asks, well, what are the upsides of this feeling of being an imposter? And they studied this in several environments, including in the healthcare system. And they found that when nurses or other healthcare providers felt a little bit like an imposter, they tended to be a lot more willing to ask if the patient was comfortable or the patient needed anything. And a lot of this feedback seeking then allowed them to give a higher standard of care. And so I tell leaders, look, some of this actually could be a really good thing. Lean into those nerves, that feeling of imposter syndrome, because that could mean that you net out, a lot better because your energy is fully engaged because you're trying to overcome that nervous feeling.
Yeah. Also for me, I think it helps keep me humble. because then I like, I'll think, at any moment this could all go away. So I've got to like, work hard to keep where I'm at.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really good, John. And something we talk about in the book too is how, part of what's unfortunate is, a lot of founders are unfortunately mostly men, but kind of the male stereotype or the male kind of norm is to not talk openly about this. And so therefore there's this assumption among especially men that imposter syndrome is probably not the most manly thing to experience. And the research shows exactly the opposite, which is it's plagued by folks who identify as male, female, non-binary. It's a phenomenon that's true of the human condition. And unfortunately, we just need to talk more about it. Like, we just need to be more open and ready to seek help with some of those negative feelings.
Yeah, I think it all goes back, or not all of it, but a lot of it goes back to just being more open, more transparent and being willing to communicate and listen.
Yeah.
And I think having a workshop, where you step away and do that stuff helps encourage that, because, a lot of people say, oh, we'll just do it while we're working. We'll just have, and you can't, it's so much harder.
And I think being aware of it is one thing, and then externalizing and sharing it with others, I think, is a whole. Some people really struggle with being vulnerable. I mean, look, while I wrote this book and talk about, like, I acknowledge that I myself will have a hard time telling people the things that I struggle with. I quite like this. There's an aphorism that goes something like, know thyself, right? That's kind of like the highest ideal. We like to riff on this in my team at Google. We say, know thyself and get over thyself. And I think realizing that, your inner secrets of how you really struggle with things, like, look, a lot of this is people actually really will really respect you more for it. There's this study that called it the beautiful mess effect, which is because we are so familiar with our shortcomings and our insecurities. Like, we look at it and it magnifies, it catastrophizes in our mind a little bit too much. But the reality is that when people look at our mess, we actually see more balance, in a more balanced way, both the good things and the bad and the insecurities of this person. And people tend to have a much more positive outlook on people who are being vulnerable than the people themselves who are trying to put themselves out there.
No, I think that's really good. I think that's one of those things that, you've got to have that positive outlook. And the beautiful mess effect, I think that just sums it up perfectly. Martin, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate it. And I think learning about the Bonfire Moment and all the cultural things that we can do as team leaders or startup founders or whatever is very helpful for us all. How can people connect with you online, learn more about the things that you're working on, and maybe pick up a copy of your book?
Yeah, great. Thank you. So we're active on LinkedIn. Myself and Josh Yellen, who's my co-author, we're both active on LinkedIn. And bonfiremoment.com is also a place that you can learn more about the book, get access to some of the tools that we externalize through the book. And we hope you grab a copy wherever wherever and however you like to consume your books. And please please reach out, and if you have questions, we'd love to have a conversation.
Awesome. I'll link all that up in the show notes too at geekleader.com, so you can click through and pick up a copy and connect with you on LinkedIn and everywhere else.
Wonderful.
Hope you enjoyed the show. Please go to geekleader.com to learn more about what this guest is up to. Click on their links and connect with them online. I would also greatly appreciate it if you could leave me a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show. Make sure you've subscribed if you haven't already. And if you feel so inclined, you can leave me a tip by going to geekleader.com/tip.